The sound began not as a roar, but as a peculiar rhythmic buzzing that seemed to vibrate from the very pavement of the iconic street, distinct from the usual cacophony of passing luxury cars and excited tourists. It was distinct, organic, and relentlessly cheerful, cutting through the cool Los Angeles air like a hot knife through butter, signaling that tonight, the rules of engagement for New Year's Eve were about to be completely rewritten by a culture that treats celebration as a serious sport. On any other night, Hollywood Boulevard is a chaotic mix of costumed superheroes, flashing neon signs, and visitors from the Midwest looking for stars on the sidewalk. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon on this specific evening, the demographic shifted with the precision of a military operation, replaced by an ocean of smiling faces, oversized distinct families, and a secret weapon made of cardboard and plastic that was about to deafen the City of Angels. For decades, the standard Hollywood New Year's Eve has been a somewhat predictable affair involving overpriced cover charges at exclusive clubs, velvet ropes that separate the elite from the public, and a polite, regulated countdown that feels more like a television broadcast than a human experience. The streets are usually patrolled by security guards ensuring flow and order, keeping the noise to acceptable municipal decibel levels, while tourists snap quick selfies before retreating to hotel rooms to watch the ball drop in New York on a screen. But this year, the script was flipped entirely as thousands of Filipinos, driven by a collective homing beacon of heritage and festivity, descended upon the Walk of Fame not to witness the spectacle, but to become the spectacle, bringing with them an energy that was palpable, electric, and utterly confusing to the uninitiated local police officers who watched the crowd swell. They arrived in waves pouring out of the metro stations and parking structures, carrying not just the essentials for the night, but what looked like entire survival kits for a siege of happiness, armed with Tupperware containers filled with spaghetti that was distinctly sweet and hot dogs that were distinctly red. You could see the grandmothers, the Lolas, navigating the crowded sidewalks with a surprising agility, their pockets filled with coins and their clothes adorned with polka dots, a visual superstition meant to attract wealth in the coming year, creating a moving sea of circles against the rigid lines of the Hollywood architecture. This wasn't just a crowd gathering, it was a relocation of the barangay spirit, a village mentality that says no one celebrates alone, and as they staked their claim on the concrete, the air grew thick with the scent of anticipation and the undeniable, savory aroma of lumpia being secretly passed around like contraband joy. At the center of this cultural phenomenon was the Torotot, a trumpet-like instrument that looks deceptively simple to the Western eye, often made of stiff paper, foil, or plastic, but holds a significance that goes far beyond a simple noisemaker. In the Philippines, the Torotot is not merely a toy. It is a sonic weapon against bad luck, a tool designed to scare away the evil spirits and misfortunes of the previous year, with a sound so piercing and discordant that no demon would dare stick around for the aftermath. The ones appearing on the boulevard were not the polite store-bought party favors you find at American drugstores that emit a pathetic wheeze. These were modified, customized, and sometimes handmade behemoths of noise, capable of producing a sound that resonates in the chest cavity. And as the first few test blasts echoed off the walls of the Dolby Theater, heads turned for blocks, realizing that the volume knob of the city had just been ripped off. The confusion among the non-Filipino tourists was almost comical to witness, as families from Germany, Japan, and Nebraska stopped in their tracks, looking around wildly to identify the source of the chaotic symphony that was beginning to tune up. They saw groups of people who weren't just standing around waiting for midnight but were actively engaging with everyone within a 10-foot radius, offering food to strangers and explaining with boisterous laughter why they were wearing 12 round fruits for prosperity. It was a collision of social norms, where the Western concept of personal space was gently but firmly dismantled by the Filipino concept of bayanihan and togetherness, forcing everyone on the street to become part of the narrative whether they had signed up for it or not. The sidewalks, usually places of transit, transformed into impromptu living rooms, creating a gridlock of humanity that was impossible to be angry at, because the sheer wattage of the smiles involved was disarming. Security personnel and local law enforcement initially looked tense, their hands hovering near their radios as they tried to categorize this sudden influx of people who were loud but decidedly non-aggressive, a crowd dynamic that didn't fit the usual profile of a rowdy New Year's mob. They watched as the Torotots were raised like heraldic trumpets, not in protest but in preparation, and they soon realized that their standard crowd control tactics were useless against an auntie offering them a plate of food and insisting they eat because they looked too thin. The tension that usually accompanies massive street gatherings in major American cities dissolved into a bizarre, festive truce, where the authority of the badge was superseded by the authority of the matriarchs who were directing foot traffic better than the officers could, ensuring that the elders had places to sit and the children stayed within the protective circle of the family unit. As the hours ticked closer to midnight, the soundscape of Hollywood Boulevard began to change fundamentally, shifting from the hum of traffic to a drone of anticipation that sounded like a swarm of giant festive bees. The Torotots were being tested more frequently now, short blasts that acted as call-and-response signals between groups separated by the throngs of people, creating a vernacular of noise that only the initiates understood. It was a way of saying "we are here," and "we are ready" without uttering a single word. A sonic claiming of space in a city that often renders minority communities invisible or silent. This was the auditory footprint of a diaspora that had spent years blending in, working hard, and keeping their heads down, deciding that for this one night, they were going to be the loudest thing in the Western Hemisphere, louder than the movies, louder than the traffic, and louder than the insecurities of living in a foreign land. The visual spectacle matched the auditory rising action, as the streetlights reflected off the foil wrappings of thousands of horns, creating a shimmering river of gold, silver, and neon colors that flowed down the pavement. People had brought oversized props, handmade signs greeting relatives back in Manila, Cebu, and Davao, and flags that waved frantically above the heads of the crowd, turning the iconic tourist trap into an embassy of the streets. The massive digital billboards that usually advertised the latest superhero blockbuster or luxury perfume seemed to pale in comparison to the vibrant, chaotic reality on the ground, where the drama was real and the cast of characters was unscripted. The energy was infectious, drawing in bystanders who had no idea what a Torotot was 5 minutes ago, but were now desperately asking where they could buy one, sensing that holding one of these horns was the only passport needed to enter the heart of the celebration. The distinct difference between the Western tradition of Auld Lang Syne, a song about looking back with nostalgia and perhaps a bit of sadness, and the Filipino tradition of absolute, ear-splitting noise became the defining conflict of the night. While the hotel parties up in the high-rises were preparing for a sentimental toast with champagne flutes and polite kisses, the street level was preparing for spiritual warfare against silence, operating on the belief that a quiet new year invites a stagnant life. The Filipinos were preparing to jump as high as they could at the stroke of midnight to stimulate growth, both physical and financial, a tradition that required physical space and athletic commitment, leading to hilarious scenes of people stretching their calves and quads in the middle of the street, as if preparing for an Olympic hurdle event, further baffling the casual observers. By 11 p.m., the takeover was absolute. The Hollywood vibe had been fully metabolized and replaced by the Manila vibe, creating a hybrid atmosphere where the glamour of the movies met the grit and warmth of the islands. The Torotots were no longer intermittent. They were becoming a constant, low-level hum that vibrated in the teeth of everyone present, a prelude to the symphony that was to come. The police had given up on maintaining strict lanes and were now simply watching from the sidelines, some even tapping their feet, realizing that this wasn't a riot, but a revolution of joy. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the instruments were tuned to a frequency of pure jubilation, waiting for the final countdown to unleash a wall of sound that would go down in history as the moment the Philippines hugged Hollywood so hard it couldn't breathe. As the final minutes of the year trickled away, the energy on Hollywood Boulevard shifted from a gathering to a vibrating, pressurized container of excitement. The casual chatter died down, replaced by a collective focus on the digital clocks glowing from phones and billboards. The Torotots were raised in unison, a forest of colorful horns pointing toward the dark sky like antennas seeking a signal from the future. It wasn't just about waiting for a new number on the calendar. It was about the physical need to release a year's worth of pent-up energy in a single explosive moment. The countdown didn't start at 10. It started at 60, a minute-long chant that grew louder with every passing second, echoing off the pavement and the famous stars beneath everyone's feet. Strangers locked arms, forming impromptu chains of humanity that stretched across the boulevard, erasing the lines between locals and tourists. The air crackled with a static charge that made the hair on your arms stand up, a physiological reaction to the sheer volume of thousands of people inhaling simultaneously, preparing to scream. The security guard stopped pacing and simply watched, knowing there was no controlling what was about to happen. When the clock finally struck midnight, the sound that erupted was not human. It was a seismic event. Thousands of Torotots were blown simultaneously, creating a single harmonious drone that sounded like a massive ship's horn blasting directly into the city's ear. It drowned out the sirens, the car horns, and even the thoughts in your own head. This wasn't just noise. It was a physical wall of sound that hit you in the chest. A triumphant roar that announced to the Pacific coast that the Filipinos had officially arrived, and they had brought the volume of the islands with them. Amidst the deafening roar, the visual chaos was equally spectacular. People weren't just blowing horns. They were leaping into the air with frantic athletic energy. The tradition of jumping high at midnight to ensure height and growth turned the street into a massive bouncing mosh pit of joy. Grandmothers, teenagers, and toddlers were all airborne, reaching for the sky in a synchronized attempt to grow taller, laughing hysterically as they landed. It was a scene of pure, unadulterated optimism, a physical manifestation of the belief that the coming year could quite literally lift you up. The bewildered tourists who had been watching from the sidelines were suddenly pulled into the fray, handed spare Torotots, and urged to blow. There was no room for observation here. Participation was mandatory. You could see the hesitation melt away from their faces as they took a breath and joined the chorus, their cheeks puffing out as they contributed to the cacophony. In that moment, cultural barriers evaporated completely, dissolved by the universal language of making as much noise as humanly possible. Hollywood Boulevard had ceased to be an American landmark. It was now a global party. The sound of the Torotot is distinct. It's not the sharp, high-pitched squeal of a party blower, but a throaty, resonant honk that carries weight. When thousands of them are played together, it creates a unique acoustic texture that feels almost industrial, a grinding, joyous rhythm that permeates everything. It's a sound that chases away bad spirits, yes, but it also chases away silence, loneliness, and the fear of the unknown. For the Filipino community present, that sound was the sound of home, a comforting blanket of noise that wrapped around them in the middle of a foreign city. As the initial explosion of noise settled into a steady, rhythmic celebration, the Happy New Year greetings began to fly like confetti. But these weren't polite nods. They were hugs, handshakes, and high fives exchanged with absolute strangers. People were running up to police officers, bus drivers, and street performers, wishing them prosperity with genuine warmth. The Bayanihan spirit was in full effect, transforming a cold metropolitan street into a warm village square where everyone was a neighbor, and every neighbor was family. The cynicism of the city didn't stand a chance against this offensive of kindness. The sensory overload was completed by the faint smell of gunpowder from illicit firecrackers popping in the distance, and the savory scent of portable feasts being unveiled. Despite the lack of tables, food was suddenly everywhere, buns, sweets, and fruits appearing from bags to be shared. It was a medianoche feast adapted for the concrete jungle, a midnight meal eaten standing up but tasted with the same gratitude as a sit-down dinner. The act of eating together on the sidewalk grounded the ethereal noise, reminding everyone that celebration is body and soul, sound and sustenance. Even 20 minutes past midnight, the energy showed no sign of fading. In most Western celebrations, the peak is midnight, and by 12:15 the crowd begins to disperse. Here, the party was just finding its groove. The Torotots were still blasting with undiminished lung power, proving that Filipino stamina for celebration is a renewable resource. The crowd wasn't thinning. It was densifying as latecomers drawn by the noise poured in from side streets, eager to catch the tail end of the rapture. The sheer endurance of the joy was a spectacle in itself. This wasn't just a New Year's Eve party. It was a statement of presence. For a few glorious hours, the most famous sidewalk in the world belonged to a people who defined themselves by their ability to find happiness in any circumstance. The Torotots were their flag, the noise was their anthem, and the smiling faces were their currency. As the night wore on, it became clear that while Hollywood might make the movies tonight, the Filipinos were making the memories, directing a blockbuster scene of happiness that no camera could fully capture, but no one present would ever forget. Eventually, biology had to catch up with enthusiasm. Around 1 a.m., the monolithic wall of sound began to develop cracks. Cheeks were sore from exertion, lungs were tired, and the Torotots, now slightly soggy from breath and the night air, began to lose their structural integrity. The unified roar fragmented into sporadic, dying honks, like a brass band running out of steam. Yet, nobody was rushing to leave. They were just catching their breath in the newly quieted street, the adrenaline slowly being replaced by the deep, satisfying exhaustion of having thoroughly welcomed the new year. The street looked like the scene of a festive explosion. The famous Walk of Fame stars were buried under a shimmering layer of foil shreds, broken plastic whistles, and spilled polka dot confetti. It was a glorious mess, the physical debris of unbridled joy scattered across one of the most photographed pavements on earth. The contrast between the glamorous facades of the Hollywood theaters and the gritty reality of a massive street party was stark, proof that real messy life had temporarily overtaken the polished movie set. Then, something remarkable happened, something that truly distinguished this crowd from typical revelers. As if on cue, the same grandmothers who had directed traffic earlier began to direct the cleanup. Plastic bags appeared from handbags and pockets. The cultural mandate of Huwag Magalat, don't litter, kicked in with full force. The partygoers transformed instantly into a sanitation crew. It wasn't obligatory, and no announcements were made. It was simply ingrained. You don't leave another person's house dirty, even if that house happens to be Hollywood Boulevard. City sanitation workers, who usually face the dawn of New Year's Day with dread, watched in disbelief from the corners as families consolidated their trash piles. They saw teenagers picking up debris that wasn't theirs, laughing as they worked together. The cleanup became part of the event itself, a final act of communal responsibility and respect. It was a surreal sight for the locals, a massive crowd cleaning up its own party before the official crews even had to ask. The street was being restored not by city ordinance, but by courtesy. By 2 a.m. the Great Migration home began. The metro stations filled again, but this time the mood was softer, sleepier. The Torotots were tucked under arms like sleeping toddlers or worn around necks like medals of honor. The trains were quiet, save for the occasional tired giggle or a final, weak toot from a surviving horn. They were leaving behind the glamour of the boulevard, heading back to reality, but they were carrying the distinct glow of a shared triumph. The local police officers finally relaxed their shoulders. Their shift had been loud, confusing, and utterly peaceful. They had witnessed a massive gathering where the only weapon was noise, and the only aggression was an insistence on being happy. There were no fights, just thousands of people armed with paper trumpets fighting off bad vibes. It was the easiest riot they'd ever policed, leaving them with ringing ears and a strange new respect for the Filipino method of crowd control via overwhelming positivity. When the last groups finally cleared out, Hollywood Boulevard fell into a profound silence. But it wasn't an empty silence. It was a ringing silence, the kind that follows a massive rock concert. The air still felt thick with the energy that had just vacated the space. The ghosts of a million Torotot blasts seemed to hang between the buildings, a sonic residue proving that something significant had just happened here. The street felt charged, permanently altered by the encounter. This takeover wasn't just about having fun. It was an unconscious assertion of existence. For a community that often operates in the background of American life, the nurses, the engineers, the service workers, taking over center stage in Hollywood was a radical act. They didn't ask for permission to be loud. They brought their own volume. They showed that their traditions didn't need to be diluted to fit into American culture. They could be turned up to maximum volume and celebrated in the mainstream. Word spread quickly on social media the next day. Videos of the Torotot Apocalypse went viral within the diaspora, with Filipinos around the world marveling at the sheer scale of the noise in such an iconic location. Precedent had been set. The community knew they could claim a space, and Hollywood knew to expect them. It was no longer just a tourist destination. It was now unofficially Filipino territory on the night of December 31st. Ultimately, the night proved that joy is a universal language, but sometimes it needs a very loud translator to be understood by everyone. The Torotot was that translator, a humble piece of cardboard that allowed a diverse diaspora to speak with one unified voice, drowning out the anxieties of the world. They came to Hollywood, the land of make-believe, and delivered something undeniably real. A noise so pure and so loud that it forced the new year to start on their terms.